Hello and welcome to How Was I Supposed to Know That? This is a podcast designed to give entrepreneurs a space to talk about the joys and pains of growing, running, and scaling a small business. And today I'm very privileged to have with us someone on my very own team from Company Counsel, my partner and colleague, John Thielen. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Bernard. Good to be here.
Great to have you here. And we are going to be talking about the M&A stage of business. That part of business ownership where you've decided to sell and you're ready to exit and you've got a buyer at the table and they start talking about due diligence and you've never heard of due diligence before. So you've hit an obstacle. So prior to any of our listeners getting to that point, we want to demystify due diligence and talk a little bit about how to prepare. So, John, I want to thank you for being here. Why don't we get started by sharing a little bit about you and what you do at Company Counsel?
Yeah, sure. Great. So, again, I'm John Thielen. I am a partner with Company Counsel. So, Bernard and I are partners and been with Company Counsel since its inception, which was coming up on our 10th year anniversary. So, my role as a partner and attorney at Company Counsel is I oversee a lot of the work product that goes out. I deal with a lot of the client relationships. I help to develop a lot of new business for the firm, but I definitely have a specialty as it relates to M&A. So really like to work with our clients that are looking to sell their business, or the flip side of that, we have a lot of clients who are looking to buy, that are entrepreneurs that are looking to do something different. So that's a big part of my practice and what we're talking about today, and that's a big focus of mine. So yeah, I love being with Company Counsel, love the culture, and excited to be here and provide some more information today.
Okay, well, check is already in the mail, but thank you. So you mentioned that you love M&A, mergers and acquisitions, and I happen to know that that's one of the things that really does seem to drive you. But I'm wondering if you could maybe elaborate on that. What is it about M&A and about representing clients through that process that really makes you feel passionate?
Sure. So I think the biggest thing is, especially sell side transactions, is it's a business owner's baby, right? They've been building the business a lot of times for 30, 40 years, sometimes even longer if it's a family business. So they really have gotten value from that business for their whole lifetimes. It's their life's work, and they want to make sure that everything is being taken care of to pass that business on and exit successfully, whatever that looks like. So that could be, it could be selling to a longtime employee. It could be to pass it along to their children. It could be to sell to an outside third party, or it could just be to retire and get some sort of payout and ride off into the sunset. So I think it's great to see that, dealing with a seller who's really built up their life's work and is ready to sell and wants to just make sure that it's done the right way, that they get the value that they're looking for, and that it's going to be handled properly going forward. So those are really valuable clients that we get to work with.
So it sounds like, I'm envisioning people riding off into the sunset, that happy ending, that happy exit.
Yeah.
Does it always go that way, or it's kind of a leading question?
Yeah.
Well, I know that it doesn't, but
it does not. Yeah, it definitely doesn't always go that way. We try to get involved early on as attorneys to increase the likelihood that it does go that way, but the reality is things can always happen and things can fall apart, and there's a lot of pitfalls that, both depending on if you're buyer or seller, that you should watch out for, and that are common. That, again, there's things that can be done from a legal perspective and working with an attorney early on to minimize that risk. But the reality is, things can go south, and it can be costly if you don't do things the right way. So that's one of the reasons it's really important to have your ducks in a row early on. Start thinking about your sale years before it's going to happen. I mean, the best time to really think about it is now, because there's certain things you can do to put those ducks in a row and prepare your documentation and think about those things before you're ready to sell. And again, that can really mitigate that risk of things going south.
So I want to unpack that a little bit.
Yeah.
First of all, what's the worst that can happen? I mean, you're talking about preparing years in advance, which a lot of people might think sounds unreasonable. How
Right.
could you possibly know years in advance what offers you have available or what opportunities there be?
Right.
And anyway, so the deal doesn't close. The big deal, you move on, right?
Right.
What's the big deal?
Yeah, it's a fair question. So a lot of times the worst that can happen is it's worse than the deal doesn't close, right? The worst case scenarios that we see are maybe a deal does close, but then something comes up post closing. That's a big issue for the buyer or the seller, right? So we do have a lot of deals that a letter of intent is signed and the parties are on the same page and some of the documents get put in place, but then things fall apart, towards the end or during the due diligence process. And most of the times when that happens, it's not a huge deal. Sometimes there's maybe a deposit that's non-refundable or some other things that could happen at that stage. But really the worst case scenarios are everything's been going well and then something happens post closing. So something could happen post closing and then the seller who sold the business and they thought they were done with it are pulled back into the business because of a lawsuit that comes up years down the line because they didn't disclose something during due diligence or there was a misrepresentation or something of that nature. So those are kind of the lingering issues that can be the big ones that sellers especially really want to avoid.
So there could be issues that linger after the sale that wind up causing legal and financial consequences to the seller, right?
Right.
Now, isn't that what the agreement's for? Isn't that what the lawyer is supposed to do when they write the agreement? Are they supposed to insulate the seller from any lingering consequences?
It's definitely a big part of it, sure, and that's a reason why both sides should have counsel. Buyer and seller should both have independent counsel to help them, review the documents, make sure their best interests are protected. But the reality is that attorneys are assisting with the legal documents for the most part. They're drafting the documents, they're reviewing the documents, they're pointing out things that their client might not be aware of, but there's still things that the business owner themselves is going to have to do, and that they might know that their attorney might not know or others might not know. So that's why it's really important to have those conversations with the attorney. The client needs to be transparent so that the attorney can properly advise them. And that's why it's really important to have kind of a custom agreement. And that kind of goes into that sale agreement. Why it's so important is because all the customizations that go into that are ultimately to protect the party, right?
So there's certainly a role for that sales agreement, and you want to pay attention to the agreement.
Yeah.
What I'd like to focus on today is the period that precedes the agreement, the due diligence period.
Yeah.
So let's start with definitions. Due diligence, I mean, people use it, they throw the term around, but I'm not sure there's really a universal definition. Or is how would you?
No, I don't think there is. I mean, typically what it refers to is the period of time where the buyer and seller are exchanging documents, right? So a lot of times that's early on before a letter of intent is signed. Sometimes documents are exchanged after a letter of intent is signed while that purchase agreement is being drafted, or even sometimes after the purchase agreement is signed. But it's basically the process of exchanging documents and really turning over the insides of your business to the other party so that they can inspect it and see what they're getting themselves into. So that could be reviewing formation and governance documents for the business. It could be reviewing contracts, leases, client agreements, things of that nature that are ultimately going to be transferred probably from the seller to the buyer. Those are things that happen during due diligence. Financials certainly are a big part of it. So buyer's going to want to see seller's financials. They're going to want to see tax returns to make sure that what they think they're buying is what they're actually buying. So all of that is kind of encompassed in due diligence, and both sides really have a role in due diligence. I mean, from the seller side, again, you want to make sure you've got your ducks in a row so that you're providing the best side of your business, but also not hiding anything when you provide it to the buyer. And then from the buy side, you want to make sure that you're reviewing everything thoroughly with counsel to really understand what you're buying, and those sorts of things can affect the purchase price ultimately.
So tell me more about that. How does due diligence impact the purchase price?
So depending on the way the letter of intent is drafted and the purchase agreement is drafted, there can be adjustments to the purchase price based on what comes out during due diligence, for example. So Most commonly, there's an initial offer, right? The parties will come together, often through a business broker or organically, but there's going to be an asking price for the business, and then there's going to be that offer price, and usually the parties have an agreement on price by the time a letter of intent is signed. But usually there's going to be some contingencies in there that if certain things come out during due diligence or are revealed in the financials, that purchase price could be subject to adjustment at that party's discretion. So, for example, if the buyer only has a limited view of the financials, and then they find out during due diligence that the seller hasn't paid their taxes in 10 years, right? They're probably not going to want to pay the same price that they had offered initially for that business. They're going to want to make sure those taxes are either paid off prior to closing, or that the purchase price is adjusted accordingly. So it can sometimes have an effect in that way.
Okay. So the seller's got their role in due diligence. They're the ones providing information. The buyer has their role in due diligence, or the ones asking for the information and processing all of it to make sure that the deal is. I think is that fair?
That's fair. Yep. And then attorneys obviously have a role, and sometimes accountants have a role, and financial advisors. So there's other professionals that are typically involved as well. Yeah.
So if I'm new to this process and I'm hearing all this for the first time, I'm listening to you describe this, and I'm just seeing dollar signs, right? All these,
Yeah.
Everybody's got an accountant, everybody's got an attorney, and other professionals, and all these document exchanges. I mean, can you just skip it? Like, could there just be a waiver of due diligence and let everybody just move on? Like, why do lawyers involved and drag things out and make things more expensive and time consuming?
Yeah, I suppose there could be if both parties agree. I mean, usually that's gonna right. It's typically going to cost them. We like to say that it's going to cost them more in the long run if that happens, right? So certainly attorneys cost money, other professionals cost money, but again, if you do it the right way and hire the right professionals and everything's done correctly, then it in theory you should be paying that money up front to those professionals, and then again that not only gives you peace of mind, but hopefully saves you that money in the long run. Where it can be costly is we do see individuals that'll deal directly without involving those other professionals, and they'll skip due diligence or glaze over parts of the process, right? And again, that's where there's an increased likelihood that something's going to go wrong in the future, and that's when you're looking at litigation, and litigation can be very costly and time consuming, and you're going to have to probably hire an attorney at that point anyway. So that's why, again, it is an investment to involve those professionals, but I think it's really valuable, and especially if it's your business, again, that you've been running and building for years, you want to pay a little bit of money to make sure it's done right.
Mm-hmm.
So I also think one thing I'll add is I think there's sometimes a misconception that attorneys can make the process more costly and time consuming, but kind of for the reasons I mentioned, they could save you money in the long run. And then, I have seen it where one of the parties doesn't have an attorney, and that can sometimes slow things down because, not to blame them, but they're not familiar with the process, right? They don't do this all the time. So if attorneys are involved in both sides, it can actually help make things go a lot smoother and quicker a lot of times.
So let's say that I'm a business owner. I've been running my company for decades. I know it inside and out. I know that I don't have any, I pay my taxes. I don't have any debt. I know I don't have any lawsuits or liabilities.
Mm-hmm.
For someone like me with a squeaky clean record, I mean, can I maybe bypass due diligence or get an easy pass through the process?
Yeah, you could get closer to an easy pass, but you still gotta go through it. So yeah, having an owner that is familiar with all those things and stays up to date with records and filings and everything is great, and it makes the process go a lot smoother. And those are the ones that are probably going to get a better value for their business because they don't have to go back later and clean things up and discover and scramble at the last minute. So that's why it's really important, again, to start thinking about it early on. So while you're running your business, make sure you're filing your reports, make sure you're doing your taxes, make sure you document everything and keep a database of those documents, right? That's another issue is people don't know where documents are located. So that can cause a lot of scrambling during the due diligence period if you're not sure where documents are and you have to go obtain a copy from the county or the city or whatever the case may be. So it's always a good idea during due diligence, but even better before, to have a central repository of documents and have it broken out into folders.
So let's talk more about that before due diligence period. So obviously the title of this episode today is preparing for due diligence, which suggests there is something that maybe can and should be done prior to due diligence starting. Earlier in the conversation, you referenced started to plan years in advance. If I'm that same business owner who knows that his stuff is squeaky clean and doesn't have any liabilities that he's aware of, what should I be doing now to prepare for a sale years from now?
Sure. So doing kind of a legal audit of your legal documents and contracts is important. So, and that's where an attorney can obviously help you think through what those documents are that you should be looking for, but making sure that you've got your formation documents and that they're up to date for the business, right? A lot of times we talk to business owners who are looking to sell and it's like some blurry fax version of their certificate of incorporation from the 80s, and then we got to get a new copy, and those aren't big deals, but it's things like that where if you can make sure you've got those documents in place now, your contracts, again, making sure like you have contracts for every client you're dealing with and all your employees, and that they're up to date. Like reviewing those things on an annual basis is really important. I think even beyond the legal side of it is also just documenting processes, right? So a good rule of thumb is prioritize the processes that you use kind of the most often in your business, and that if once you leave the business, once you're no longer the owner, that you could hand over and that person would be able to follow that process and the new owner can step right in and it's a seamless transition, right? I think a lot of times, especially where it's one owner who's owned the business for a long time, they know how to do everything, and that can be great, but the issue is then no one else knows how to do what they're doing, and if it's not documented, then when you ultimately go to sell, that's when again issues can arise because the new owner is not going to be able to do things that they were always done. So that's another thing you can do is just document processes, keep them in that central repository, make sure staff's aware of them and where to access them, those types of things.
And these are things that would be requested during due diligence, those processes and those SOPs.
They could be, yes. Yeah, certainly contracts will be accessed during due diligence, and then internal processes, onboarding employees, offboarding employees, things of that nature. You would typically want to see during due diligence, and a lot of times people don't have those things documented, right? So if you can document those important processes and make sure they're accessible and followed by everyone in the organization, then that's going to save a lot of headache down the line.
So obviously we all know that you're a business attorney. You talked about your focus on M&A. At what point in the life cycle, if I'm thinking about M&A, if I'm thinking about an exit maybe 2 or 3 years from now, at what point should I pick up the phone and give you a call? And I know you're going to say sooner rather than later, but I want you to defend it, and I want you to be specific about what you would actually be doing. If I'm trying to sell 3 years from now, is there really anything for us to be talking about now, or is it more a heads up about what's going to happen down the road?
Yeah, it could be a little bit of both. So I think that the second you start to think about selling is a good time to reach out to an attorney and kind of do that legal audit of sorts, right? So we've got checklists that we use at Company Counsel. We have strategy sessions with clients all the time to go through those types of issues. So that's something you can do at any stage. You don't have to be necessarily ready to sell or months away from selling. You could just be running your business and determine it's a good time for a legal audit, and that's going to be a really valuable exercise now. More specifically than that, typically if you're the seller, when you're thinking about listing the business for sale, would be a good time to engage an attorney. So the attorney's typically not going to be the one that actually lists the business for sale and finds the buyer. That's usually again, something a business broker might do or you might do organically. But that's really the stage where you want to start having that conversation about, okay, what's the next step in the process? And usually that is a letter of intent of sorts to get that in place. So I think that's really kind of that crucial moment of when to really engage an attorney seriously.
Mm-hmm. So sooner rather than later, but no later than the letter of intent stage.
Correct. Yep.
And how long does what happens during the letter of intent stage, and how long does that stage typically last?
It can vary. The letter of intent stage, typically what it is one of the sides will present the other. Typically the buyer will present the seller with a letter of intent to purchase, right? And that'll contain some of the high level terms regarding the proposed purchase. So purchase price, how that's going to be paid, what the anticipated closing date might be, maybe certain reps and warranties are in that letter of intent. So that's usually going to come from buyer to seller. Sometimes seller ideally will want to review that with their attorney, make sure it's good to go, that they're comfortable signing. Sometimes there's some negotiation back and forth, but ultimately it's going to get to a point where that's signed, and then the parties are bound to an extent. Letters of intent they're typically non-binding, or most of the terms are non-binding until a formal agreement is reached. But that's kind of when you start to have more of an exclusivity between the parties. And again, that timeline can vary, but I would say usually when a letter of intent is presented to the time it's ultimately signed, maybe two weeks to a month, depending on, again, hopefully the parties have had a conversation at that point already about the purchase price, because if they're far apart in the purchase price, then obviously the deal could either fall apart or it's going to take a little bit longer to get that signed.
And so once the LOI is signed, what happens next?
Yeah, so that's when you're going to turn your attention to start to do some due diligence, right? So some might have already been conducted, financials to an extent might have already been produced to kind of get an idea on the purchase price, but due diligence is going to start, and a formal purchase agreement is really going to be the binding document, right? So that's going to be something where one of the side's attorneys will take the lead on drafting like the formal purchase or sale agreement. And again, due diligence is going to be happening a lot of times simultaneously with that. So it's usually a letter of intent, due diligence, and formal purchase agreement. And then typically due diligence is usually 30 to 45 days, can sometimes be shorter, sometimes a little bit longer, but usually that's kind of what that due diligence period looks like. And then once due diligence is done, parties agree to sign. There's usually a closing date, and then at closing, which could be in person or it could be virtual, that's when monies are going to be exchanged, assets are actually going to be transferred, a bill of sale of sorts is going to be signed, and that's kind of the closing of the transaction.
So the due diligence period that you referenced, you said minimum 30 days.
Typically, yes.
Typically that, maybe a little longer.
Yeah.
The size of the transaction matter? Does the complexity of the deal matter?
It could. A lot of times it's not always necessarily the purchase price that affects the complexity of the deal. It could be other things, right? It could be if there's multiple owners involved or employees, or again, if contracts need to be assigned over and there's certain deadlines on that, or there's contingencies around a lease agreement and you need a landlord's approval, right? Those are things that can cause it to be a little bit more complex or take a little bit more time. But a lot of times we see the deals that are a few $100,000 take the same amount of time that the deals that are $5 million. So the size of the deal doesn't necessarily affect the timeline.
So as you look back over your career as an M&A attorney, someone who's really led sellers through this process over and over and over again,
Mm-hmm.
What memories stand out for you in terms of either great experiences that you got to share with
Mm-hmm.
the client, or maybe some things that you learned as a result of what you saw? Anything stand out?
Yeah, definitely. So like I said, we've really helped a lot of sellers who have owned their business for a long time. So we've had some really valuable ones that service-based businesses, right? Local service-based businesses that have built up a great reputation in the Philadelphia community and the mainline community. And, we've walked them through that process, and they're stressed because it's their baby. They want to make sure it's done the right way and it's in the right hands. But, when that process is done and closing happens, and it's just such a great feeling all around, and to see the joy on their face that they're getting paid for something that they built over the last however many decades is a really rewarding feeling. So those stand out. The kind of the family-based businesses that have reputations in the area, those are really, really great ones for us. And then the flip side is, we've seen some that we've dealt with that have turned into litigation, unfortunately. So, and there's always things that could be done differently, but some of those horror stories that I kind of mentioned of a worst case scenario where the deal's done and maybe things go well, but then something comes up after the fact, right? Whether it's a tax liability or some sort of lawsuit that pops up, and the parties are both involved in it. Unfortunately, that does happen, and we've seen a few of those. And again, we do our best to mitigate that risk on the front end, but we can also help on the the back end of it to litigate on behalf of our clients. So we have seen a few of those as well, but for the most part, they do go well.
So any parting words of wisdom for all the entrepreneurs out there listening to this right now?
Reach out to us. I mean, think about what it would be like to not be the one that's in your business. I think especially the one that's for the ones that are one owner businesses where they've done everything. You really want to think through what's my ideal exit look like, first of all, right? Who is that selling to? I think you always want to think about your kind of ideal exit, but also on top of that, reach out to an attorney to have that discussion so that you can get a little bit of peace of mind. And, I think there's some information on the podcast about how to reach out to us, but my email is jthielen@companycounsel.law. That's JTHIELEN @companycounsel, COUNSEL.LAW. We also have a 484-325-5660 number that goes to our office, and you can set up a meeting with me or one of the other attorneys on our team that way. But those are some things I would recommend before getting too far down the line with it.
Well, this has been a great conversation, John. It's always a pleasure to speak to you, but I think you really helped some people today with this information.
That's great. Yeah, I appreciate you having me on.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you.